You're seeing them post happy photos with someone new, and in your mind a question pierces like a needle. Why are they gentle with that person, yet cold and hurtful with me? But if you pause long enough to look directly at the structure of a narcissist, you will realize they didn't choose someone better. They simply chose someone more compatible with their mechanism, compatible in a way that allows them to keep functioning without having to face themselves. A narcissist does not hunt for love. They hunt for a safe position for the false self. They need someone who doubts themselves instead of doubting them, who stays silent instead of asking questions, who sacrifices their needs instead of demanding mutuality. And here is the shocking part. The one they end up with is usually not the most outstanding, the most beautiful, the smartest, or someone who beat you in the way you imagine, but the most easily guided person in the room, someone willing to call control, care, call ambiguity, mystery, call emotional coldness. They're just tired, and call their own gradual disappearance. If I love enough, they will change. A narcissist does not need a life partner. They need a platform to stand on, a mirror that reflects the exact angle they prefer. And most importantly, someone who does not make them pay for the truth. In this video, we will peel back each layer of illusion that social media and your self-blame have helped cultivate, so you can clearly see who that unexpected character really is, what price they pay for being chosen, and why the moment you begin to wake up, you are no longer a safe option, not because you are lacking, but because you have become the one thing a narcissist cannot tolerate, a person with boundaries, awareness, and a reality that can no longer be rewritten. Part 1. The selection mechanism. They don't choose a person, they choose a function. When we say a narcissist does not choose a person but chooses a function, we are touching the coldest core of that psychological structure. In a healthy relationship, people seek the meeting of two selves. In a relationship with a narcissist, what is sought is not connection but service. They do not walk into a room asking, "Who moves me?" but with an unconscious radar scanning, "Who will help me maintain the image I am trying to preserve?" This may sound harsh, but if you look back at your own experience, you will see the signs were there from the beginning. Even in your earliest conversations, they were not genuinely curious about your inner world in the way a mature person is curious about another human being. They were observing your reactions. When they told a slightly exaggerated story, they were not waiting for you to share, they were waiting for you to believe. When they expressed a view that contradicted reality, they were not seeking dialogue, they were seeking agreement. When they arrived late, broke a promise, or made a joke that made you uncomfortable, they were not merely testing your sense of humor, they were measuring whether you were willing to adjust your boundaries to keep the peace. That was the invisible interview. A narcissist does not need the smartest person in the room. They need someone willing to doubt their own intelligence when challenged. They do not need the strongest person. They need someone who will use that strength to protect them rather than protect themselves. They do not need the deepest person. They need someone who will set that depth aside when it begins to ask questions. Therefore, their choice is never based on your intrinsic value, but on the level of friction you create within their defensive system. In analytical psychology, Carl Jung described the social mask, the persona that we use to interact with the world, and the shadow, the part that contains what we do not want to admit. In a psychologically integrated individual, these two aspects can gradually be reconciled. But in a narcissist, the mask becomes a rigid structure that must be protected at all costs, while the shadow is so deeply denied that they cannot tolerate anyone seeing it. They therefore need someone to act as scaffolding for that mask, someone who will reflect the ideal image they want to believe and will never dig into the shadow beneath it. When you begin asking questions, when you remember inconsistencies in what they say, when you demand alignment between words and actions, You are not merely asking for respect, you are creating friction. And friction, for a narcissist, is not an opportunity for growth. It is a threat of collapse. They live in a state of constantly maintaining a fragile ego structure through external energy. Admiration, agreement, subtle compliance. These are the fuel that keeps their image stable. Anything that requires them to review their mistakes, admit flaws, or take responsibility is like a hole in the hull of a ship. If not sealed, it could sink the entire vessel. So they look for someone who will seal that hole with their own silence. You may have once believed they chose someone new because that person was better than you in some specific way, more beautiful, younger, kinder, more obedient. But in reality, what determines their choice is not better but less resistant. Narcissists gravitate toward where they have to explain less, change less, and confront less. If you have ever felt that the clearer, calmer, and more confident you became, the more irritated, distant, or even aggressive they grew, then you have touched this truth. When you stop regulating their emotions for them, they are forced to face their own, and that is what they avoid at all costs. The function they seek in a partner often revolves around three pillars: reflection, regulation, and submission. Reflection means you validate the image they want to believe about themselves. Regulation means you absorb tension, soothe insecurity, and stabilize their self-esteem. Submission means you adjust your personal needs so as not to threaten their central position. When someone fulfills all three pillars, the relationship may appear peaceful from the outside because there are no major arguments or open conflicts. But that calm is not harmony between two mature individuals. It is the result of one person ceasing to fully exist. A narcissist does not fear losing you because you lack value. They fear losing you when you stop performing the function they depend on. This explains why some people remain for years in toxic relationships. They unconsciously believe that love means self-sacrifice, that calming another's anger proves devotion, that tolerating subtle criticisms is the price of keeping a family intact. For a narcissist, that is the ideal environment because they do not have to change. They only have to continue receiving. Look deeper. A relationship built on function rather than connection will always lack depth. It may endure in form, it may appear stable, but inside it is parallel loneliness. A narcissist does not truly see the other as an independent subject. They see a tool for emotional regulation and ego reinforcement. And when that tool begins to express its own needs, begins to say no, begins to demand respect, they feel betrayed, as if the mirror has suddenly reflected an image they do not want to see. That is why, once you understand they do not choose people but choose functions, you stop comparing yourself to the new partner. You realize that no longer fitting that function is not failure, it is growth. You stopped acting as scaffolding for an unhealthy structure. You stop calling control care, stop calling silence maturity, stop calling devaluation. They're just stressed. And when you stop doing those things, you became difficult in their eyes. But difficult here does not mean hard to love. It means hard to manipulate. An emotionally mature person seeks a partner who can challenge them, disagree with them, and grow alongside them. A narcissist seeks an environment that does not demand growth. So the real question is not, why didn't they choose me? But what did I stop providing that they depended on? When you frame the question this way, you move from the position of victim to that of a conscious observer. You understand that your worth is not measured by your ability to sustain someone else's illusion. And most importantly, you understand that being chosen for a function is never an honor. Being loved for who you truly are is what is worthy of desire. If one day you find that you no longer fit the role someone is trying to assign you, do not panic. You may not be losing love. You may be losing a position in an unhealthy system. And sometimes Not being chosen for a function is the first step toward being chosen for truth. Part 2. When you become too hard to control. There comes a point in the relationship when you begin to change, and ironically, that healthy change becomes the greatest threat to the narcissist. In the beginning, you may have been reactive, trying to explain yourself, arguing to exhaustion just to be understood, apologizing for things you did not cause, simply to keep the peace. At that time, you were still inside their loop, unconsciously participating in the script they had written. They attacked, you defended, they went silent, you panicked, they criticized, you doubted yourself. But one day, you became tired. Not tired of loving, but tired of realizing you were losing yourself. You began to read, to listen to your intuition, to observe instead of react. You noticed that every time they blamed you, it was actually a way to avoid responsibility. You realized their sudden bursts of anger were not proof of your inadequacy, but evidence of their inability to tolerate their own sense of imperfection. And from that moment on, you were no longer easy to control. Your shift was not loud or dramatic. It was not rebellion. It was a quietness, and that quietness was terrifying to a narcissist. You no longer tried to prove you were right. You no longer rushed to repair every argument. You no longer absorbed each demeaning remark as if it were truth. You began saying, "I disagree," without trembling. You began saying, "That hurts me," without apologizing for your feelings. You began remaining silent when they attempted to provoke you, and that conscious silence stripped them of power. A narcissist survives on your reactions. Your anger proves they still control your emotions. Your tears prove they still have influence. Your pleading proves they remain at the center. But when you stop reacting as before, when you look at them with clarity instead of fear, something breaks. You no longer serve as the receiver of emotions they do not want to carry. Psychologically, narcissists often use a mechanism in which they unconsciously project their negative emotions onto others and make the other person feel them as their own. When they feel shame, they make you feel ashamed. When they feel insecure, they make you feel inadequate. When they are angry about failures elsewhere, they find a reason to unload it onto you. In the past, you took it on without realizing. You tried to fix yourself, to be better, to love harder. But once you became aware, you stopped accepting the package. You began distinguishing between what was truly yours and what was being transferred. You stopped automatically carrying responsibility for every tension in the room. And when you stopped being the container for their shadow, that shadow returned to where it belonged. For a narcissist, that is nearly unbearable. They have built an entire defensive system to avoid facing their own vulnerability, wounds, and incompleteness. Your growth is like turning on a light in a room they always kept dark. You do not attack them. You do not expose them publicly. You simply refuse to accept a distorted version of reality. And that alone is enough to make them feel out of control. Many people mistake strength for aggression. But real strength here is the ability to remain calm when provoked, the ability not to enter a battle you know will drag you down. When you stop trying to change them and begin changing how you respond, you withdraw their primary source of supply. They may escalate their tactics. Harsher criticism, longer silences, irrational jealousy, more blatant blame. But if you hold your boundaries, if you do not return to your old role, their insecurity grows. Because the relationship with you was once a place where they could discharge pressure without consequence. Becoming hard to control does not mean you became worse. It means you stopped accepting the role of emotional regulator for another adult. You no longer see soothing their anger as your responsibility. You no longer believe love equals endurance. And that shift exposes a painful truth. They did not love your independent self. They loved the version of you that was pliable. When that version disappears, they feel as if they have lost a familiar tool. The painful part is that you may have believed you were ruining the relationship when you began setting boundaries. You may have wondered whether you had become cold, selfish, or overly sensitive. In reality, you were stepping into psychological maturity, reclaiming the parts of yourself that had dissolved into someone else's needs. A relationship cannot survive if one person must shrink for the other to feel big. When you grow, you are not pushing them away. Their control-based structure simply no longer has room for you. Narcissists often leave when they sense you are no longer easy to manipulate, but they rarely admit that. Instead, they may say you have changed, that you are not the same, that you are difficult, that you exhaust them. What they are truly saying is, you no longer operate according to the old script. You no longer doubt yourself every time they deny reality. You no longer rush to fix yourself whenever they appear disappointed. And when a narcissist realizes they can no longer control the emotional current of the relationship, they often withdraw to seek a less challenging environment. Because facing you now means facing themselves. The truth is, when you become too hard to control, you do not lose your value, you restore it. You do not destroy love, you reject a structure that was never built on real love. You do not fail to keep them, you succeed in keeping yourself. And if anything truly frightens a narcissist, it is not your anger, it is your clarity. Because once you see clearly, you no longer fear losing them. And once you no longer fear, they no longer hold the same power over you. Part 3. The one they run to. The psychological profile of naivety. When you ask yourself who a narcissist runs to after leaving a relationship, you may become haunted by the image of someone better than you by some social standard. But the truth is more subtle and far more painful. They do not run to someone superior. They run to someone who has not yet seen the game. That person often carries a very specific psychological profile, not because they are inherently weak, but because they are at a stage in life where they have never been forced to question something that looked too good to be true. They believe in goodwill as a default. They believe that if someone says they are wounded, it must be sincere. They interpret intensity as proof of deep connection rather than a warning sign of possession. They do not enter relationships with thick defensive filters. They enter with openness, and that openness becomes an unlocked door. A narcissist does not seek an equal rival in inner strength. They seek a mind willing to assimilate. They observe whether the other person has a tendency to rescue others, whether they feel valuable when they are needed, whether they share private wounds too early. When someone reveals their entire painful history in the first few meetings, a narcissist does not see vulnerability, they see a lack of boundaries. When someone quickly accepts canceled plans, vague explanations, or contradictory stories without questioning them, a narcissist does not see sweetness, they see convenience. The psychological profile of naivety is not stupidity. It is trust that has not yet been deeply betrayed. It is someone who still believes that if they are compassionate enough, the other person will be moved. If they are patient enough, the other person will mature. If they love enough, the other person will heal. At that moment, the narcissist activates the victim role. Stories of being misunderstood, of a crazy ex, of a world that has treated them unfairly. The listener feels special for being chosen as the one who understands. They think, I will be different. I will not abandon them. What they do not realize is that they are stepping into a script that has already been repeated many times, only the names have changed. Narcissists are drawn to people who identify strongly with the caregiver role. People who believe loving means taking responsibility for another's emotions. People who confuse control with care, jealousy with passion, constant demands with attachment. When a narcissist texts constantly, wants to know where you are, insists on being prioritized above all other relationships, the naive partner may interpret it as, they love me so much. They have not yet learned that intensity does not equal safety. A narcissist sees in them an ideal reflective surface, minimal resistance, abundant agreement, willingness to self-adjust in order to maintain peace. Most importantly, they lack a map to recognize manipulation. They have not gone through the painful process of separating truth from illusion. So when they are idealized, they believe it is destiny. They interpret being placed on a pedestal as validation of their worth, rather than as a binding strategy. This psychological profile often includes a deep need to be recognized as the special one. The narcissist exploits this by creating exclusivity. Only you understand me. I've never opened up like this before. You're different from everyone else. These are not just sweet words, they are anchors. When someone believes they are the exception, they will protect that position at all costs. They will ignore early warning signs. A subtle insult disguised as humor, a silent punishment, a carefully framed blame. They will reinterpret their own discomfort to preserve the narrative that we are special. It is important to say clearly, the person drawn into this role does not deserve contempt. They simply have not yet experienced enough to realize that boundaries are a form of self-love. A narcissist does not choose them because they are better than you. They choose them because they are easier to integrate into the control system at that particular time. Naivety here is not a lack of intelligence. It is a lack of exposure to manipulation. Someone who has never been made to doubt their own reality will not easily recognize when it begins. When criticized repeatedly, they may believe something is truly wrong with them. When anxiety rises without clear cause, they may think they are too sensitive. When they are subtly distanced from friends and family, they may believe love simply requires prioritization. A narcissist needs someone willing to trade independence for the feeling of being chosen. They do not seek equality. They seek dependency. And dependency is rarely obvious at first. It begins with small things, asking for approval on every decision, seeking constant reassurance, feeling anxious when the other person seems displeased. When someone bases their entire self-worth on keeping their partner satisfied, they become fertile ground for control. The most painful part is that from the outside, the new partner may appear happy, enchanted, as though they have found something you lacked. But what you are witnessing is often the early stage of identity erosion. When there is no friction, everything seems smooth. When no one asks questions, there is no conflict. But the absence of conflict does not mean compatibility. It often means one person has not yet dared to fully exist. The psychological profile of naivety includes the belief that love must be preserved at all costs. The narcissist exploits this by alternating between idealization and withdrawal. They offer intense attention, then sudden coldness. They elevate, then devalue. And the naive partner, unaware of the conditioning mechanism at play, clings tighter each time warmth is briefly restored. They believe they are fighting for love, when in reality they are fighting to preserve the feeling of being special. The narcissist is not drawn to their inner depth. They are drawn to the other person's willingness to set that depth aside to maintain peace. Once you understand this, comparison begins to dissolve, because the defining factor is not who is superior, but who fits the role being sought. You yourself may once have carried this profile at a different stage of your life. You believed, you rescued, you endured. And that experience is precisely what awakened you. The person they run to now is simply standing where you once stood. They have not defeated you. They have simply not yet walked the road you have already traveled. And the most important truth to remember is this: naivety is not a fixed identity. It is a phase. One day, if they are courageous enough to look directly at what is happening, they too may realize that being chosen is not an honor when the price is losing oneself. Part 4. The image of happiness, a mechanism of impression management. What shakes you the most is not that they have someone new, but that they appear so happy it almost erases your entire experience. A photo of them holding hands on a beach, a caption about destiny, a smile that seems more peaceful than ever, and in that moment you begin to doubt your own memory. You wonder whether the outbursts of anger, the cold silences, the pointless arguments truly existed, or whether you were simply too sensitive. But to understand what is happening, you must separate emotion from the image and view it as a psychological mechanism, not a love story. Narcissists do not merely live in relationships. They live in the image of relationships. For them, external perception is not a natural byproduct of deep connection. It is a tool for protecting the ego. When you see them publicly happy, what you are witnessing is not evidence of inner growth, but a carefully operated strategy of impression management. They understand that image is power. If they can create a convincing portrait of stability, they are not only persuading others, they are persuading themselves that they are not the problem. The early stage of a relationship with a narcissist is often flooded with idealization. The new partner is elevated, praised, surrounded by intense attention. From the outside, it looks like passionate love. In reality, it is the phase in which the narcissist is enjoying the experience of being perfectly reflected. When the other person looks at them with admiration untouched by doubt, they feel whole. The smile you see on social media is not the smile of deep emotional bonding. It is the smile of an ego being fed. The peace you perceive is not maturity. It is the absence of friction. In a healthy relationship, two distinct individuals will inevitably collide because they have their own needs, opinions, and boundaries. Friction is not a sign of failure. It is an opportunity for deeper understanding. But in a relationship with a narcissist, the absence of conflict often does not come from harmony. It comes from one person's silence. When the new partner has not yet asked questions, demanded consistency, or refused what makes them uncomfortable, everything appears smooth. And that smoothness is presented as proof that this time is different. You need to understand something crucial. Narcissists are highly sensitive to how they are perceived. They may invest enormous energy in constructing the image of a perfect couple, especially if they know you or mutual acquaintances are watching. Public displays of happiness are not always simple expressions of joy. Sometimes they are indirect messages. I'm fine. I'm not the problem. The previous partner was. This becomes a subtle form of triangulation, where the new partner serves as living evidence to reinforce the narrative they tell about the past. You see the photos and unconsciously compare. Why could they be so gentle with this person but not with me? What you forget is that in the beginning, you once looked at them with that same gaze. You, too, were once placed in the only one position. The difference is not your worth, it is timing. The new partner is in the stage where the image remains intact, unchallenged by reality. Narcissists can imitate the behaviors of love convincingly. They know how to say the right words at the right time, how to capture moments from flattering angles, how to write captions that resonate emotionally. But imitation is not the same as inner experience. A photograph does not capture difficult conversations, cold moments behind closed doors, or the quiet confusion of someone wondering what they did wrong. Images are curated, lighting adjusted, smiles held at just the right second. This does not mean all emotion is fake. A narcissist may genuinely feel exhilarated in the early phase, but that exhilaration is often tied to being admired and idealized, not to deeply seeing and accepting another human being with flaws and complexity. When you look at that image of happiness and feel replaced, remember, a narcissist does not transform their personality structure simply because they change partners. The deeper patterns, avoidance of responsibility, blame shifting, constant need for admiration do not disappear because a new face stands beside them. The only thing that changes is the stage and the audience. If the new partner continues to reflect the image they want to see, the performance continues. But if one day that partner expresses independent needs, questions, inconsistencies, or simply stops reflecting perfectly, friction will surface. And when friction appears, the same cycle will repeat, even if it is not publicly displayed. Impression management is a strategy to maintain control of the narrative. If the world believes they are happy and stable, they do not have to confront the possibility that something is wrong within them. And if you begin to believe that you were solely responsible for the previous relationship's failure, they have successfully redirected doubt. So instead of viewing those images as evidence against you, see them as the visible surface of a defensive structure. Performed happiness is not the same as deep connection. The absence of visible conflict is not proof of maturity. Public display is not proof of inner security. When you stop allowing those images to define your worth, you begin to reclaim reality. You remember that what you left was not paradise, but a structure in which you had to shrink yourself to maintain peace. And you understand that a photograph can capture a moment, but it never tells the whole story behind a closed door. Part 5. The fate of the one who stays. The slow disappearance. The fate of the one who stays does not begin with a dramatic collapse, but with an almost invisible erosion, a gradual fading, so subtle that they do not even realize they are dissolving into the air. When the door closes and the spotlight of social media turns off, their real life is not a sequence of endless romantic moments. It is an unpaid, full-time job, regulating the emotions of an adult who cannot regulate themselves. At first, they compromise on small things. They choose silence instead of challenging a comment that makes them uncomfortable. They adjust their schedule to be more compatible. They reduce time with friends because their partner seems displeased. All of this is justified with a simple sentence: love requires sacrifice. But in a healthy relationship, sacrifice is mutual. Here, it flows in only one direction. The one who stays begins to live in a state of heightened vigilance. They wake up not asking, "What do I want today?" but "What mood are they in today?" They learn to read subtle shifts in tone, slight furrows of the brow, unusual pauses. They become experts in microanalysis, not out of fascination with psychology, but because their sense of safety depends on predicting the storm before it hits. When the narcissist returns home irritated from work, the one who stays immediately switches to soothing mode, agreeing, affirming, cooking a favorite meal, avoiding topics that could trigger conflict. When the narcissist feels insecure, they become the source of praise, reassurance, admiration. Gradually, they carry not only their own emotional load, but also the unprocessed emotions of their partner. This does not happen overnight. It unfolds slowly, repeatedly, until it becomes the new normal. A cutting remark disguised as a joke is tolerated. A broken promise without apology is overlooked. A silent punishment is excused as "they're just stressed." Each acceptance pushes the boundary back a little further. The one who stays begins to rationalize what they once considered unacceptable. They tell themselves everyone has flaws, every relationship has challenges. But there is a difference between shared difficulty and systematic erosion. In this structure, the narcissist does not take responsibility for their negative emotions. They project them outward, and the one who stays wanting peace, fearing loss, believing they can help, absorbs them. Over time, the erosion affects not only emotions but identity. The one who stays begins to edit themselves. They speak less about what excites them if their partner shows indifference. They change how they dress if criticized. They scale down too big dreams if dismissed as unrealistic. They censor thoughts before speaking, wondering whether this might disturb the atmosphere. And in that process, pieces of their authentic self are set aside, then forgotten. From the outside, the relationship may look stable. There are no loud breakups, no public tears. But inside, the one who stays lives in chronic tension. Their nervous system becomes accustomed to vigilance, to preparing for the next potential rupture. The exhaustion accumulates, not only mentally but physically. Insomnia, headaches, depletion. They may look in the mirror and see themselves aging faster, not because of time, but because of the continuous pressure of maintaining stability for two people. One mechanism that keeps them there is the alternation between coldness and warmth. If the narcissist were always cruel, the relationship would have collapsed long ago. But they are not. After a tense period, they may suddenly become tender. They may apologize, promise, change, plan a romantic evening reminiscent of the early days. These moments act like medicine. The one who stays clings to them as proof that the person I love is still there. They believe the difficult phases are temporary, and the sweetness is the true essence. In reality, the intermittent sweetness is what prevents departure. Each time warmth follows a stretch of coldness, the brain releases relief and hope returns. Meanwhile, self-esteem erodes. Repeated criticisms, even subtle ones, plant seeds of doubt. They begin to believe they are truly difficult, truly too sensitive, truly lucky to be chosen. And when someone believes they are fortunate simply to be accepted, they will endure more than they ever thought possible. The fate of the one who stays is not victory. It is the exchange of potential for surface stability. They may remain for years, even a lifetime, but the cost is the gradual shrinking of themselves. They stop pursuing what once made them shine. They stop asking what they want from life. They focus on preventing the structure from collapsing, even when that structure does not nourish them. The most painful part is that they may not recognize their disappearance until much later, when looking back. When you look at the one who stays and feel envy because they were chosen, you are only seeing the surface of a complex system. You do not see the nights they ask themselves what they did wrong. You do not see the moments they swallow dissatisfaction to avoid another argument. You do not see the loneliness of standing beside someone who does not truly see them. A narcissist can maintain a long-term relationship, but longevity does not equal depth. They keep the person who accepts the role the longest, and that role is often the regulator, the endurer, the sacrificer. The slow disappearance of the one who stays is the silent tragedy of a relationship in which one person expands by shrinking the other. If there is one thing to say clearly, it is this: staying is not always proof of strength, and leaving is not always failure. Sometimes leaving is the only act that keeps you intact, and staying within a structure that does not allow you to fully exist may be the slowest way to lose yourself. Part 6. The final truth. They do not end up with anyone. The final truth you must be calm enough to face is this: a narcissist does not truly end up with anyone, because within their psychological structure, there is no destination called mature attachment. What hurts you is not only that they have someone new, but the fear that one day they will build what they could not build with you, a deep, stable, fulfilling relationship. You fear that you are the only one who failed to keep them, that with someone else they will finally learn how to love properly. But that fear rests on a false assumption, that they are moving forward. In reality, narcissists do not evolve through relationships. They repeat them. They do not follow a linear path of growth. They move in a closed cycle whose center never changes. That cycle begins with idealization, where the new partner is placed on a pedestal and viewed as the solution to all inner insecurities. Then comes control, when they must ensure a steady supply of emotional validation. Then disappointment, when the other person no longer reflects the perfect image they want to see. And finally, devaluation or replacement, when the tool no longer functions smoothly. What changes is only the face beside them. The internal structure remains intact. A narcissist does not end up with someone because they never truly connect with that person as an independent subject. They end up with their own pattern. Each new relationship is not a completely different beginning, but a slightly revised version of the same old script. They carry the same fear of being seen, the same avoidance of responsibility, the same need for constant admiration. If anything shifts over time, it is often not growth but increased rigidity. As age progresses, as external charm fades, as success becomes less capable of masking inner emptiness, they may become more clingy, more demanding, more bitter, because instead of integrating the denied parts of themselves, they continue to reject them. And a person who cannot admit mistakes cannot learn from them. A person who cannot face shame cannot transform it. Therefore, they do not develop, they reenact. You may see a couple together for decades and wonder whether they have finally settled. But outward stability does not equal inner vitality. Two people can remain together for years in parallel loneliness, one constantly seeking attention, the other constantly avoiding conflict. That is not the destination of mature love. It is a prolonged compromise between the need for control and the fear of abandonment. A narcissist can maintain a long-term relationship if the other person accepts the role long enough. But that role is not to be seen, understood, or to grow. It is to maintain the system. And when the system functions, they call it stability. You need to understand this. They did not leave you to move toward a better future. They left an environment that had become too reflective. When you began to see them clearly, when you stopped believing the story they told about themselves, you were no longer a safe place for their illusion. So they sought a new setting where the script could be restarted. But restarting is not upgrading. It is simply returning to the starting point with different actors. If you observe long enough, you will notice familiar patterns resurfacing. Early idealization, subtle control, small fractures, repeated blame. The cycle may last longer if the other person resists less, but the structure remains unchanged. This truth is not meant to diminish them or label them permanently, but to free you from the illusion that you were replaced by someone better. You were not replaced. You were exchanged within a system that distinguishes not individuals, but functions. And when someone is seen as a function, they can always be replaced. The most painful realization may be that you once believed love could heal them, but healing cannot come from outside if the inside is unwilling. Growth requires self-examination, acknowledgement, and the courage to face one's shadow. If someone spends a lifetime avoiding that, they will repeat the same pain in different forms. So when you ask, who will they finally end up with? The realistic answer is, they end up with their own unresolved pattern. They carry it from relationship to relationship like invisible luggage that is never opened and processed. You, however, if you choose to learn from the experience, do not have to carry the same luggage. You may carry wounds, but wounds can become insight. You may carry sadness, but sadness can become clearer boundaries. The difference between you and them is not who has more relationships, but who is willing to grow from what happened. A narcissist may have many stories, many characters passing through their life, yet the depth of connection remains fixed at the same level. You may have fewer stories, but each one can become a step toward maturity. So do not fear that they will reach a happily ever after from which you were excluded. Lifelong happiness cannot be built on the foundation of avoiding truth. And if there is a real ending, it is not about who they are beside. It is about whether they ever face themselves. As for you, your real ending is not about who stands next to you, but whether you preserve your integrity. When you understand that they do not end up with anyone, they only repeat themselves, you stop looking toward them for answers. You turn forward, toward where real growth occurs. And that is where your story begins to change. And then, after all the analysis of selection mechanisms, staged images, the fate of the one who stays, and the endlessly repeating cycle with no true destination, we return to the original question, not who will they end up with, but where will you end up after this experience? Because the deepest truth does not lie in the life of the narcissist. It lies in your shift. They may continue running in their circle, changing settings, changing faces, changing the story they tell the world. But if you are courageous enough to stop, to look directly at what happened without distorting it to ease the pain, you have already stepped out of that loop. Do not confuse their having someone new with personal growth. Do not confuse outward silence with inner peace. And most importantly, do not confuse your leaving with failure. Some relationships are not born to be repaired, but to awaken you. Some losses are not meant to punish you, but to return you to yourself. A narcissist may continue searching for the perfect reflection of their ego. But you, if you choose awareness over illusion, will begin searching for something deeper. A connection where you do not have to shrink, remain silent, or strain to be allowed to stay. You will learn to recognize that peace does not come from the absence of conflict, but from being able to be yourself without fear of punishment. True liberation does not lie in them realizing their mistakes, nor in them returning with an apology, nor in their life collapsing. Liberation lies in the moment you no longer need any of those things to feel worthy. When you stop watching them to measure yourself, when you stop using their outward happiness as a verdict on your value, you reclaim the authority to define your own reality. And that is the quietest victory of all. Not victory over them, but victory over the fear within you. Not being chosen, but choosing yourself. A narcissist may live a life wide in the number of relationships, yet shallow in true connection. You, if you continue walking toward truth, may not have many dramatic stories, but you will have a deep life, one in which you do not have to perform to be loved. In the end, the real surprise is not who they end up with. The real surprise is you, the one who once believed you had lost, turning out to be the only one who stepped out of the play. And when you step off that stage, you do not carry bitterness, you carry awareness. And that awareness is the doorway to a love that does not require impression management, does not demand the sacrifice of identity, and does not confine you to the dark room of illusion. You were not left behind. You were returned to yourself.